It was a bright, sunny day outside St. Mary's Hospital. The sky was blue, and the warm summer air made the world feel safe and happy. The hospital doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and out came Miss Evelyn pushing a wheelchair. In the wheelchair sat a small 7-year-old girl named Emma Walker. She was wrapped in a soft pink blanket. Emma had been sick for many weeks. She had trouble breathing, and the doctors had worked hard to help her get better. Now, after so much time in the hospital, she was finally going home. Emma took a deep breath of fresh air. She missed the outside world. She missed home. She looked up at the bright sky, her pale face glowing in the sunlight. "I can't wait to go home," Emma whispered. Her voice was soft like the wind. Miss Evelyn, her nanny, smiled kindly. She was an older woman, her face full of wrinkles from years of taking care of children. She had spent many days and nights by Emma's side, helping her through the worst of her sickness. "Your daddy will be here any minute, sweetheart," she said, patting Emma's hand gently. Emma smiled, feeling safe. But just as they reached the parking lot, something terrible happened. Not far away, a police car sat quietly, the engine humming like a lazy lion in the sun. Inside the car was Officer Garrett. He was a tall man with sharp eyes and a strong jaw. His face was cold like stone. He watched people coming and going, his eyes scanning them with a frown. He liked being in control. He liked making people afraid. Then he saw Miss Evelyn and Emma. His eyes narrowed. His mind twisted with ugly thoughts. He saw an old black woman pushing a little white girl in a wheelchair, and in his heart, something dark grew. Without thinking, he snapped off his seatbelt. Click. The sound echoed in the parking lot. He fixed his belt so that his gun was easy to reach. Then he stepped out of the car, his boots hitting the pavement hard. His voice rang out, sharp and loud. "Hey you." Miss Evelyn stopped. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned slowly, her hands still on Emma's wheelchair. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but unsure. Officer Garrett walked closer. His eyes were cold, and his hand hovered near his gun. "What are you doing with that little girl?" he asked. His voice was deep, rough, and full of suspicion. Miss Evelyn blinked in surprise. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Why was this man asking such a question? "I'm her nanny," she explained. "She was just in the hospital. We're going home." But Officer Garrett didn't believe her. His lips curled into a sneer, a fake, mean smile. "Oh really?" he said. His voice was full of doubt. Emma's small hands gripped her blanket tighter. She didn't understand everything, but she knew something was wrong. The air felt heavy. Scary. Miss Evelyn frowned. Her patience was wearing thin. "Sir, I don't know what this is about, but I assure you..." Before she could finish, Officer Garrett grabbed the wheelchair's handles. Emma gasped. Her little body shook with fear. Miss Evelyn's heart pounded. Her hands clenched into fists. "What do you think you're doing?" she shouted. Officer Garrett didn't answer. His grip on the wheelchair tightened. His jaw was set. His eyes were full of something ugly. "She looks scared," he said. "I think she's being kidnapped." The words hit Miss Evelyn like a slap. Kidnapped? She felt anger rising inside her. How dare he say such a thing? Emma's lips trembled. Her tiny voice broke through the tension. "I'm not kidnapped," she whispered. But Officer Garrett didn't listen. His mind was made up. He reached for his belt. Jangle. The metal buckle clanked as he pulled out his taser. The black weapon gleamed in the sunlight. It made a buzzing noise, little sparks of electricity crackling at its tip. People around them gasped. Some took out their phones to record. Others whispered in shock. Miss Evelyn's voice shook with desperation. "Sir, put that away. She's a sick child." But Officer Garrett didn't stop. He aimed the taser at Emma. Emma's eyes filled with tears. They spilled down her pale cheeks, soaking into her pink blanket. She was too weak to run, too scared to scream. And Officer Garrett was too blind with anger to see the truth. But then, a deep, powerful voice rang out through the parking lot. "Step away from my daughter." The air went silent. Everyone turned. Standing at the edge of the parking lot, his huge frame casting a long shadow, was Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. His face was like a storm. His eyes burned with fury. His fists were clenched at his sides. His entire body was tense, like a lion ready to strike. He took a slow, dangerous step forward. "Get your hands off my daughter's wheelchair," The Rock growled. His voice was low, steady, and full of power. Officer Garrett froze. For a second, fear flickered in his eyes. He wasn't used to people challenging him. I was just," he started. The Rock didn't let him finish. "You were just what?" The Rock asked, his voice dripping with anger. Pointing a weapon at my sick little girl? Emma looked up, relief flooding her face. Daddy, she sobbed. That one word made The Rock's rage explode. In a flash, he was in front of Officer Garrett. Before the cop could react, The Rock grabbed his wrist, twisting it just enough to make him drop the taser. Clatter. The weapon hit the ground. The Rock stepped closer, towering over him. You think you're tough? The Rock growled. Threatening a sick child? Harassing an innocent woman? Officer Garrett swallowed hard. He tried to back away, but The Rock didn't let him. Look at her, The Rock commanded, pointing to Emma. Look. Her. Officer Garrett hesitated. He looked down at the small girl, wrapped in her pink blanket, her face streaked with tears. Reality hit him like a brick. He had almost hurt a sick child. The crowd watched in tense silence. Some people murmured angrily. Others shook their heads in disgust. A man in the crowd spoke up. We saw everything, he said. You should be ashamed of yourself. Another woman added, we got it all on camera. Officer Garrett's face turned red. The Rock leaned in close, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. Leave. Now. Officer Garrett didn't argue. He backed away, his face pale. Without another word, he turned and hurried to his car. The Rock didn't watch him leave. He had more important things to do. He turned to his daughter, kneeling beside her. Baby girl, he said gently, wiping her tears away. You're safe now. Emma sniffled. Daddy, I was so scared. I know, sweetheart. The Rock hugged her, his big arms wrapping around her small frame. No one will ever hurt you. Not while I'm here. Ms. Evelyn wiped her own tears. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. The Rock looked up at her and nodded. Thank you for protecting her. The crowd started clapping. People cheered. Justice had been served. And as The Rock pushed Emma's wheelchair toward their car, the sun shone down on them, warm and bright. She was finally going home. Safe and loved. The loud sound of an engine filled the air like a big storm coming closer. The deep rumbling noise made the ground shake as if thunder was rolling across the sky. Then, with a loud screech, a huge black truck came to a stop right in front of the hospital. The truck was massive, powerful, and strong, just like the man who stepped out of it. The door swung open and out stepped Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. He was tall and broad, his muscles big like boulders. His face was hard like stone, his jaw clenched tight. He looked like a warrior, a hero stepping into battle. The air around him felt different, heavy, like the world itself knew something big was about to happen. Everything around him seemed to freeze. The wind stopped. The people standing nearby held their breath. It was like time itself had been trapped in his presence. And then The Rock saw her. His little girl, Emma, was huddled on the ground, clinging to a blanket. Her tiny fingers trembled like leaves shaking in the wind. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear. And standing over her was Officer Garrett. In his hand, Garrett held a taser, a weapon that sent out painful electric shocks. It buzzed and crackled with energy, like a tiny storm trapped in metal. The weapon was pointed straight at Emma, a helpless little girl. For a moment there was silence. A deep, dangerous silence. And then, boom. The Rock moved. Faster than a lightning bolt, faster than anyone had ever seen, The Rock charged forward. His massive legs powered him across the parking lot like a raging bull. His arms, strong like steel, reached out. Before Garrett could even blink, The Rock grabbed his wrist in an iron grip. It felt like a bear trap snapping shut. Garrett gasped, his eyes widening in shock. He had no time to react before The Rock twisted his arm. Ah! Garrett screamed in pain. The taser fell from his hand, hitting the ground with a sharp clatter. Sparks fizzled as it rolled away, useless now. The people watching gasped. A crowd had gathered, eyes wide, mouths open. No one had ever seen anything like this. Garrett, desperate to fight back, lunged for his baton, a long, heavy stick police officers used. His fingers stretched out, reaching for the weapon like a drowning man reaching for air. But before he could grab it, thud. The Rock's fist smashed into Garrett's stomach. It was like a wrecking ball hitting a wall. The air in Garrett's lungs rushed out in a painful gasp. He stumbled backward, his back slamming into his patrol car. His body shook from the impact. Garrett gasped for breath, his chest rising and falling quickly. His face twisted in pain. He was shocked, stunned, as if he had been hit by the fist of Zeus. But The Rock wasn't done. His body shook with rage. His muscles tensed, his eyes burned with a fire hotter than the sun. His whole body was like a volcano ready to explode. You pointed a weapon at my daughter? The Rock's voice was low, dangerous. Garrett said nothing. He was too scared to speak. The Rock's face darkened. His voice rose, filled with the fury of a father protecting his child. "My 7-year-old daughter." The Rock roared. His voice shook the air. It was so powerful, so loud that it felt like the ground itself trembled. Garrett's hand shook. He was trapped, helpless. But still he tried one last time. His fingers reached for his radio, his only chance to call for backup. But the Rock was too fast. Before Garrett could even grab it, the Rock's massive hand grabbed the front of his uniform. And then, slam. Garrett's body hit the car again hard. The whole parking lot echoed with the sound. The crowd gasped again, their eyes filled with shock. The Rock stood over him, towering like a giant. His chest rose and fell, his breathing heavy. His iron grip held Garrett in place, keeping him trapped. "You feel powerful?" The Rock asked, his voice like thunder. Garrett didn't answer. His legs shook. The Rock leaned in close, his face inches away. His breath was hot against Garrett's skin. "Does threatening children make you feel strong?" The Rock growled. Garrett gulped. He couldn't breathe. His face pressed against the hard, cold metal of the car. His voice was weak, trembling. "Let me go," he whispered. But the Rock wasn't done. He leaned in even closer, his voice now a whisper. A whisper filled with danger. "You're lucky I know when to stop," the Rock growled. "Because if I didn't, you would be nothing more than a stain on this ground." Garrett's heart pounded. Sweat dripped down his face. And then, weebo, weebo. Sirens filled the air. The sound grew louder and louder, echoing through the parking lot like a drumbeat. Garrett's fear grew stronger. His breathing was fast and shaky. A convoy of police cars raced into the parking lot, their tires screeching as they came to a stop. Their doors flew open and officers rushed out. Their hands moved to their holsters, fingers ready to draw their weapons. And then, they saw him. The Rock. The strongest man in the world. The Titan standing in front of them. They froze, their hands hovering over their weapons, unsure of what to do. And in the middle of it all, Garrett, beaten and terrified, still trapped in the Rock's grip. The Rock stood tall over Officer Garrett, who had no weapon and was shaking with fear. His power and authority were clear. No one questioned it. The other officers who had arrived hesitated, unsure of what to do next. The air was tense, thick with the weight of what had just happened. Then Captain Daniel arrived. He was an older man, his silver hair and lined face showing years of experience. But there was something about him. He carried himself with a calm that none of his officers could match. His voice was deep and rough, but not cruel like Garrett had been. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. But when he spoke, people listened. "What's going on here?" Captain Daniel demanded. The Rock still had his eyes locked on the trembling officer, who was pinned against his own police car. Slowly, the Rock turned to face the captain. His gaze was strong, unshaken, like he had no fear at all. "Ask the people recording," the Rock growled. His voice was low, steady, and full of meaning. As if on cue, the crowd lifted their phones higher. They had been recording everything, making sure the truth couldn't be hidden. The bright screens reflected in the officer's eyes. The scene felt like something out of a movie, the crowd acting as silent witnesses to what was happening. Captain Daniel took one of the bystanders' phones and watched the video playing on the screen. His face darkened with each passing second. His jaw tightened. His fists clenched. When the video ended, he looked up, his eyes burning with righteous anger. "Cuff him," he ordered. His voice was sharp and final, leaving no room for argument. Two officers moved quickly, their faces tense. They didn't look at Garrett as they pulled out their handcuffs. They just did their job, knowing that the truth had already been caught on camera. Garrett, who had been frozen in shock, suddenly snapped out of it. His fear turned into anger. He glared at his fellow officers, trying to resist as they grabbed his arms. "No. Wait. You can't do this," he shouted. His voice was wild, desperate. But it was too late. The cold metal cuffs clicked around his wrists. His hands were now locked behind his back. His face turned pale, his mouth opening and closing as if he wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. Captain Daniel stared at him with eyes as hard as stone. His voice was steady and emotionless as he said, "You're under arrest for excessive force and endangering a minor." Garrett's eyes widened even more. He shook his head, trying to speak, but his voice came out as a jumble of broken words. Captain Daniel didn't care to listen. His gaze didn't waver. "You're a disgrace to the badge, Garrett." The other officers held Garrett tightly and led him away. He struggled, but there was no escaping what had already been done. The crowd watched as he was taken to a police car, his future uncertain. The Rock, now calmer, turned away from the scene and looked down at his daughter. He knelt down to her level, his large, strong hands wiping away a single tear rolling down her cheek. "You okay, baby girl?" he asked softly. His voice was no longer deep and powerful. It was gentle and full of love. Emma sniffled, her small hands clinging to his arms. She was still shaken, but with her father here, she felt safe. "You saved me, Daddy," she whispered. The Rock, a man so strong that the world saw him as unstoppable, was now just a father. He cupped Emma's face in his hands and kissed her forehead gently. "Always," he murmured. His voice was husky with emotion. "Daddy's always got your back, baby girl." Then The Rock stood up and faced the crowd. Their phones were still recording, their eyes still watching. His voice, deep and thunderous, cut through the silence. "This isn't about me," he said. His tone was full of conviction. "No child, no person should ever have to live in fear because of people who abuse their power. We have to be better than this. We have to stand up for what's right. We have to hold ourselves and our leaders accountable." His words hit hard. The crowd listened, taking in every syllable. Then, without another word, The Rock turned and picked up his daughter. He carried her to his truck, placing her safely inside. She was his most precious treasure, and he would always protect her. The engine roared to life as he drove away, leaving behind the scene of chaos. But even as he left, his words remained. The people who had heard them would not forget. The video recordings would be shared, spreading his message to the world. Justice had been served, but the fight was far from over. If you enjoyed this story, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories filled with adventure, mystery, and excitement. Your support means the world, and it helps keep these stories coming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.